Hi everyone, welcome to the role-specific training for site PIs. We are happy to have you here today. Sorry we're a couple minutes late. We had some difficulty with some people getting on, but we are happy that you joined us. I just wanted to lay out a couple of rules as we go forward for the training. At any time during the training, if you have a question, please feel free to use the chat area and type your question in. We will be monitoring the questions here, and our plan is to deal with all questions at the end of the webinar. Secondly, at the end of the webinar, if you do have a question you would like to ask, there is a hand raising feature. It's a little hand that you should be able to see on your panel. And if you will just raise your hand in that way, I will know that you have a question and I'll be able to unmute you and you'll be able to ask your question to the group. So that is how we plan to do things today. And currently you are muted, and if you have anything you need to say, please chat it into the chat box and we will go ahead and get started with our training.
So this is Heather Kaplan. I'm here today. So one of the co-PIs for the study. Shahzad is having some technical difficulties trying to get on, and Jen is on the line. Oh, Jen, can you speak now? It looks like maybe you can.
Yep, I'm here.
Awesome. Mm-hmm. And then Lisa as well.
Hi everybody. This is Lisa Opapari. I'm one of the co-PIs in the study as well. Thanks for joining today. We appreciate it.
Lisa, do you want to go ahead and start while we're waiting for Shahzad? I'm trying to text him and see if I can figure out what's going on.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, we're trying to help Shahzad get on. We're not sure. He's having some technical difficulties, but we will go ahead and get started. And then when he comes on, I'm seeing his name appear actually, so he may be on sooner than we think.
Yes, I made him a panelist. Shahzad, if you can hear me, please unmute yourself and you will be able to get started. If not, Lisa, we'll go ahead and you can chime in when you're ready, Shahzad.
Yeah, it looks like Shahzad is you're showing up as being self-muted on your end. So yeah, you can unmute yourself either on the computer or phone. That would be great. But I will go ahead and get started. And Shahzad, if you can hear us, as soon as you're on, just jump in and you can take over. So if we can go to the next slide. Okay, so the purpose of today's training is to review the role of the site PI. We're doing individual trainings all week long. We met with dietitians yesterday, PIs today, and then the coordinators tomorrow to talk about specific responsibilities and today related to the produce study. So today we're going to first talk a little bit about general PI responsibilities associated with a research study, and then we're going to talk about things related specifically to produce, in particular study advertising, participant identification, screening, enrollment, eligibility verification. That's really important for the produce study, so we're going to spend a fair amount of time on that. And then monitoring participant progress through the N-of-1 trial, and then finally adverse event reporting. Next slide. Okay, so in terms of general PI responsibilities associated with research, first is that the PI needs to be appropriately qualified to assume responsibility for the conduct of the study. As the site PI, you are really the one who is responsible and in charge of how the study is run at your site. Two, your role is to ensure the medical care for all study participants, your patient and others' patients. Three, it's to be willing to comply with good clinical practice and all the applicable rules and clinical protocols. Four, to be prepared for audits and monitoring, which unfortunately can happen at any time, so to make sure that all the documentation and records are in line with protocol and kept up. Five, to supervise your appropriate delegation of authority logs for all the personnel who are part of the study. To monitor and report adverse events according to the protocol, and we will spend some time talking about that. And then, of course, to be mindful of the timelines that need to be met for protocol compliance. And it looks like, Shahzad, that we should be able to hear you now. Can you say something if you're on?
I can say sorry. The technical issue seems to be overwhelming. Can you guys hear me?
Well, we can hear you, and I am going to stop talking and let you take over.
Okay. Where are we? Okay. Did you finish up the slide?
I just finished up the slide on general PI responsibility. So.
Okay, great. Talking about tag teaming and jumping in to take care of business. So thank you so much, everyone. And I apologize for the technical glitches. You can plan for everything, but it doesn't fall through in the end at times. Anyway, so as Lisa was saying about general PI responsibilities, not only that we have to think about the protocol specific roles for the principal investigators, but some good practices for the general PI responsibilities should also be kept in mind. And I also apologize for those who probably attended the ICN community conference. This may be repetitive and redundant for you guys, but I think it's good to sort of revisit and refresh some of these things. So other things to keep in mind as generally speaking as a PI is to ensure that enough and adequate resources are leveraged for you to do the job properly, and that facilities are not only available but also accessible to you guys as PIs. And this is true for any research study that you want to take on. It is critically important that you share the study information with your colleagues, because they are ultimately going to make it be successful or not. Also, please ensure that all colleagues, associates, and other staff assisting in the conduct of the research study are appropriately educated and informed of the study procedures, how to get informed consent, and what are the requirements that reside in that process, what are the potential adverse events that can occur with that particular study, and what are the reporting requirements that need to happen if that adverse event is noted or identified. And also, what are the data collection requirements that are pertaining, generally speaking, for the study itself. The role of the PI also includes having a supervisory oversight of all study personnel. So this includes not only the research coordinators, but also, depending upon the type of study, that the dietitians, as well as data and regulatory personnel. It's equally important to communicate with the site coordinator center. We have recognized that this is a really critically important aspect, especially for studies that are being run through Improved Care Now network. And it's very important that the PIs themselves, or they assign somebody from their team to attend the site huddle calls that happen on a regular basis, because it's a really great opportunity to share not only best practices, but also bring up issues that may be very relevant to your site and resolve those. Next slide, please. As is true for any study that needs to happen, the PI should be well aware of details of the specific protocol, including inclusion-exclusion criteria. What are the timelines that need to happen to have the study come to a successful conclusion, adverse events and how to report them as previously stated, what are the data requirements for the study, how to recognize and report protocol deviations, and be very actively involved in the contracting and IRB interaction. If the PI can show active engagement, oftentimes the process for contracting and IRB approval is fast-tracked. Another aspect of the general responsibility resides in appropriate monitoring of the implementation of the protocol. This includes reviewing eligibility criteria for patients in a very regular, consistent, and reliable standardized fashion, oftentimes in a weekly meetings, but If that is too onerous, maybe at least every other week. Verifying the eligibility of the identified patients and subjects, monitoring participant progress through the study according to the timeline of the protocol, and then again, equally important in monitoring and reporting out study failures so that other sites can learn from this process as well. Next slide, please. It's also important that when you sign up to be the PI for the site, you know what the denominator and capabilities of your site are. So make sure that we are able to recruit for the study in sufficient numbers and in a timely fashion. Also, develop and conceptualize a process for recruitment flow for your own specific site. Each site is different, and the process may be different for this flow and recruitment to occur at each site. Also, think about engaging in the study staff and other providers and educating them so that they do not end up coming across as being coercive or influencing on a participant's decision to consent to the study. So educate, but not force. Ensure that no study activities have taken place prior to the participant signing the consent form, and also make sure that staff and providers are very well informed about the protocol and their study responsibilities. And oftentimes, the PIs have to sign off on delegation log as well as other documentation attesting to the various capabilities of the study personnel. Next slide. Ensure and review data completes on a very scheduled and regular basis. This ties in very nicely with the previous slide about having a regular process. And these site responsibilities are focused specifically on data, fidelity, and quality. Data is what the study will be judged at, and so ensuring that the data quality is really, really critically important. Set expectations with the research team and the staff to complete data entry in a very timely fashion, and also assume responsibility for doing it for yourself as well. Also maintain adequate and accurate research subject records to reflect the adherence to the protocol specific requirements, because if there are going to be protocol deviations, you need to know what those are and how to document them. Next slide, please. We came up with this sort of a document and a table to help each site think about and conceptualize how this regular meeting can be documented and hardwired into their process. If you guys find this helpful, please do let us know. And if you want to modify it to suit your own site, I think that is definitely possible. We certainly have started using it for another study, and has actually served really nicely in keeping us on track and making sure that we are not missing out on any important or relevant aspect of the study progress. So basically goes over the old business, especially related to patient follow-ups, new recruitment, any reasons for dropouts, adverse event documentation, regulatory upkeep and progress, safety reports, what are the next milestones that you guys may need to be thinking about, what are the monitoring visits, how often they're happening, what needs to be done for those visits, and oftentimes contracting processes and issues that can be part of the progress of a study. And then you can make special notes how the work is going. Remember, the U.S. primary investigator or principal investigator for the site can delegate these tasks, but ultimately are responsible yourself for making sure that those tasks are done appropriately and in a sensible as well as legal way. Next slide, please. this slide sort of talks about what can happen if you're not diligent and paying attention. The non-compliance with study protocol and may run the gamut from simple mistakes to something close to being fraud. Even if they're simple mistakes, they can be pretty costly. Consent forms may not be done in a proper way, and that can lead to lots of issues, medical legally as well as protocol-wise. Specimen handling and processing may lead to extra cost, loss of samples, labeling, improper labeling, so a whole gamut of issues that can reside from non-adherence and a poor attention to some of these things. And the consequences can range from loss of data, as we can see from the specimen handling or mislabeling, as well as professional and reputational risk for the institution and the principal investigator. Next slide. So I think Dr. Burgess was supposed to do this, so I'm not sure whether she's, well, it looks like she's on. Jen, it's all yours, and I apologize again for being late.
No problem. Hi, I'm Jen Burgess. I'm the site PI for Lucile Packard Children's Hospital at Stanford, and we're just going to go through some more details of how to spread the word about this study at your institution and generating some sort of motivation and excitement and knowledge about this study to help recruit the right patients. So next slide. So just as with any study, really with what Shahzad reviews, there's going to be sort of site-specific communication within your study team, but given the vast number of patients followed at your institutions with all sorts of GI providers, that communication and education is going to have to extend to the greater group to help them learn about the study. They may have heard about it already through ICN or your own discussions, but the details of this study are important, especially when we focus on the types of patients and parents that we want to participate in the study, those that are sort of motivated and engaged, as it is going to take a significant amount of effort on the patient and parents' part to get this study off the ground. And we need to keep them engaged. As you know, when you've looked through the study procedure timeline, many of these the interactions with the patients after some initial baseline visits are sort of done by the phone. And so really helping people understand what the study is and for providers to sort of know what their patient might be doing as they move through the study. They may be seeing their own provider while still connecting with the study staff. So the team has developed several options to help to figure out what would work best in your team. You know, clearly, anytime your institution is starting out a study, I'm sure at your division meeting or at a conference, a noon conference lecture that's given once a week for fellows, there's opportunity to kind of review newer studies that your division is anticipating starting or involved with. An introductory email, we could even help with sort of a template for that to sort of explain the study. And I think helping to figure out for your individual site what the role of the PIs on the study and how you might interact with the general GI provider of that patient and figuring out how to balance the roles and phone calls and questions from the family. That's going to be have to be something that each PI and their colleagues are going to figure out. There are study handouts and pamphlets to share and posters to put in the clinic workspaces. And Dr. Susskind is a big fan of these pins that you could wear on your white coat if you're a white coat wearer, or your name tag or what have you, to just be a topic of conversation for people to ask questions, whether it's about the produce study or whether it's actually about just nutrition in inflammatory bowel disease at all. Next slide. So as a research group at your institution, figuring out how often you're going to check in with other providers to update them on patient participation and recruitment of their patients. So whether this is in person, whether this is by email, figuring out what's going to work best to update your group on how these patients and families are being followed, or which ones maybe said no, because maybe this was something offered to them as an option to help control their disease. And if they opted no, then clearly another discussion needs to happen with alternative medication therapy, say. And this is going to be a study where we're going to need to continue to enroll patients over time. So continuing to remind providers down the line after the initial excitement maybe wanes that your goal of recruitment is still out there. Next slide. When we think about sort of direct patient advertising, there were different ways that we as a group thought about doing that. We've made a letter that could go out to referring gastroenterologists. So you may have some providers in your community that look at your site as sort of a tertiary care place, a place for second opinions, or a place for more unique therapy, such as the specific carbohydrate diet. And getting a letter out to them with a pamphlet about the study might allow their patients who could either hear about it on ICN or for that own provider to bring up as an option. So reaching patients that maybe aren't being seen in your clinic. Just as you would with providers, hanging posters in the clinic. If you guys send out an IBD newsletter, flyers on education days, remembering that these things will be our best way to gauge and get to increase really patient interest and motivation in this study. And I think when we're looking at a diet that takes a lot of effort, that can require some big changes, some big lifestyle changes at home, really getting a patient that comes to you with some knowledge or interest and asking about participating in the diet or the study may be your most motivated patient and to be successful through the study, and versus a patient who is a bit blindsided by the idea of the diet in clinic. Just having that initial motivation, I think, especially for the initial patients, will really get the whole study site engaged and the patient engaged. And that's what we mean by sort of creating a pull for participation. So getting the news and information out there, getting the excitement up, and really being getting the right motivated patients into the study. Next slide. This is a good point to remember that anything that faces the patient must be IRB approved. And so we have flyers and posters and letters that process has happened for, but we have to be very careful so sites can't create, unless I guess it would go through their own IRB approval process, their own documents, but to use what we've created. There's less stringent rules, I would say, around discussion with your own colleagues at, say, presenting at your noon conference. But remembering anything patient-facing needs to get that IRB stamp of approval. Next slide. So we have kind of instilled the responsibility in each individual site, PI, research coordinator, to figure out what workflow, and you'll see many of these swim lanes in some future slides, to figure out how you at your site are going to identify patients, how you're going to approach and contact them, and what your initial enrollment visits might need. And so what although we've created some options and ideas based on maybe the time that you're seeing the patient, maybe identifying a patient in pre-visit planning versus identifying a patient that day in clinic, how these different swim lanes and time frames for consenting, enrolling, and starting the diet would sort of play out. Clearly, you're able to sort of get some information out and prepare a patient in advance, or prepare a provider in advance if it's someone identified at a pre-visit planning, versus just trying to find the right information to share with a patient in that moment if they're coming for a visit with increased abdominal pain and diarrhea, and the diet is proposed and the study is proposed as a way to approach mitigating those symptoms. So we've thought about two approaches to recruitment. I guess the second one is twofold. So one, maybe it's a patient that just reaches out, self-referring prior to a clinic visit, finds out your site, is interested or is involved in the produce study, and is curious if they're eligible. And so that opens up a window of opportunity to seek information in advance as to their to be able to screen them and decide the right clinic visit to figure out eligibility for the study, and then whether patients are identified at either a pre-visit planning meeting or a clinic visit. Next slide. So we wanted to work through some definitions. So pre-screening would be something that, say, providers are doing in pre-visit planning. So thinking about sort of static eligibility criteria. So what age in pre-visit planning are you even going to bring up the produce? What's their diagnosis? Do they have history of fistulas? Would they have a smartphone? You may not know that or not, sort of in advance of a visit. And then screening, we're calling it a formal assessment of going step by step through inclusion and exclusion criteria at the time of the baseline clinic visit. And that includes, are they meeting laboratory or calprotectin criteria and disease activity scores that have been predefined as making a patient eligible or not. Figuring out how this type of teaching is gonna, or this type of screening would be done. The pre-screening could be done by the study staff, by the research coordinator. That screening could be education that's given to other providers in your group to help identify a patient, right, at their sort of standard follow-up visit for an increase of symptoms, whether this patient would be formally, could be formally approached for the study. There is a standard of care, a medical visit that needs to happen within 2 weeks of enrollment. That visit is where actual disease index score will be done, and eligibility can be obtained at that visit. It may be the same as a baseline enrollment visit, or it could be, say, by another GI provider who says this patient is eligible, they're interested, they meet criteria, here's their disease index score. Then they're going to contact the site PI, who then sets up a baseline enrollment visit a week, 2 weeks later to sit and do full eligibility verification, the actual consent process, downloading the app on their smartphone, doing all the diet education. We've identified that baseline visit would be a lengthy one, and sometimes based on how your clinics are running, you've identified a patient, you may not have a full hour plus to block off a room or block off time in your schedule to be available in that moment for enrollment. So we realize that it may need to be a subsequent visit that's coordinated, where all of the formal consent and education and enrollment steps can be undertaken. Okay, next slide. Oh, these are the swim lanes. I guess my one point, if we just go back to the last slide, I think it's also important to remember, because sometimes we forget the study procedure timeline, that the patients actually don't start the diet or the study until 2 weeks after your baseline enrollment visit. And so there is a ramp up time. And I think that's an important piece of information for both providers and patients to know as you're thinking about screening, is there is clearly this is something that's going to have a steep learning curve initially. And so remembering that a standard medical visit, there's information that patients could be learning, then there's a baseline enrollment visit. But really it's not until 2 weeks after consenting, educating, getting the app on the phone that the diet actually starts. So it's important through this entire process to maintain a unrestricted diet. That's important for initial baseline lab tests and stool studies. And I think takes the pressure off a bit of the family that this is all about eligibility or sort of screening, eligibility, learning, and then the time to actually start the diet is 2 weeks after that enrollment visit. So hopefully I think that is an important point. Okay, next slide. I think this is Lisa, maybe?
I think I can.
Oh, you're back. Okay, thanks, Shazad.
I'm back, I think. Thank you, Jen. That was really nicely set up for the swim lanes. As Dr. Burgess just shared, conceptualizing these swim lanes for each site is going to be important. We have, again, come up with some processes and steps that we think are going to be relevant. We really want you guys to think about this and see if this is going to work for your site as well. And if there are modifications that you guys need to do, we would love to hear about how you would go about doing that. So the first step, these are the two sort of enrollment or accessing of the patients as previously stated. The first scenario that we sort of touched upon was the self-motivated family who are really have heard about the diet and want to enroll the child into that, and they are going to contact their either their care team, which may or may not be the site PI for the study, and that's primary GI or site PI can then talk to them about the study information to gauge some interest, and if they do seem to be interested, then the primary GI or the site PI can then contact the coordinator to set up phone follow-up or an in-person follow-up to discuss about different aspects of the trial and set up some pre-screening. If the patient does pass that pre-screening step, then the screening will follow. And the dietitians will be informed at the same time that the patient is coming in for a screening opportunity. However, if during this process, the PI or the provider find out that the patient may have been interested initially, but after hearing about some of the details, they seem reluctant, and then we need to stop that process and document that the patient was not interested. Oftentimes, we will find out that if it's a non-IBD provider, they oftentimes may not be that educated or feel comfortable talking about the SCD diet, and it's perfectly fine for them to contact the site PI and have the site PI be the initial contact person when they're talking to the family to gauge their interest. I guess that may be another sort of aspect of the protocol-specific role that you guys as site PIs can sort of adopt, which may be a little bit different than other studies here. During the screening process, the research coordinator will ensure that the standard medical visit is scheduled and is completed within the 2 weeks of the baseline visit, which could be on the same time, and then completes the baseline screening in conjunction with the standardized care. Research coordinators then also verifies that all the requirements for pre-screening are accurate and are completed. These are then reviewed by the site PI, making sure that the disease is not in remission, is mild to moderately active, and if they are confirmed, the eligibility is assessed and entered into the electronic case report forms. If the patient fails to be eligible, then again, this process is stopped and documented as such. If the patient is deemed to be eligible, the care providers are then meeting with the family and able to assess whether they are able to stay for further baseline visit consenting and enrollment processes. If they are able to, then this process will happen at that time. However, if they're not, then we may need to conduct a different baseline visit. We also need to make sure that the baseline visit is organized with the dietitian on board, because the education will happen and the consenting will need to happen with that, along with the download of the app onto the smartphone. Next slide, please. So this is the second scenario where the patient may not be the patient, or the family may not be the initiating contact step, and the patient may be identified through pre-visit planning process, through chart reviews, through discussion in division meetings or clinic visit, and somebody sort of recognizes that this patient may be a potential eligible patient for participating in the trial. If it happens to be a non-site PI patient, we should definitely check with the primary provider to make sure that they are okay for the team to approach them. If they give the green light, the peer provider may themselves call the patient to introduce the study, or they may ask the research coordinator to do that. And this is usually happening at the clinic visit. If the patient expresses an interest, then the dietitian can be notified at the same time, and they're available for that extra step in this setting where the pre-screening needs to happen to make sure that the patient is interested and eligible for participation. If the patient, if this is happening on an in-person visit, if the patient cannot stay, then that a follow-up time can be scheduled through the research coordinator within a week of that pre-screening visit. And if it is happening on the phone, then the pre-screening visit or follow-up call can be scheduled within 1 week. Similarly, if the patient doesn't seem interested or is ineligible, we need to document that in the process and stop recruiting from there on. The rest of the flow is pretty similar to the self-referred patient flow, whereas the baseline visit is scheduled, standardized medical visit is completed during that baseline visit, and screening labs along with activity scores are also obtained to assess eligibility. The PI then reviews and signs off, and the patient is then approached for scheduling the baseline visit for obtaining of consent and enrollment and downloading of the app. Next slide, please. So as we had sort of previously talked about, the added responsibility for the PI for the study will be ensuring adequate recruitment and approach for the patients in conjunction with the primary GI provider if they happen to be a non-site PI patient. Communication with your colleagues are going to be critically important. Sharing of information as well as keeping them engaged will go a long way in ensuring timely recruitment of participants into the study. ensuring that individuals introducing the study to participants are very knowledgeable about the study protocols is also critically important. Thinking and devising processes along with monitoring of those processes to ensure that all labs are available to the baseline enrollment visit need to happen, especially for those patients who will enroll on the same day as their baseline medical visit. And this is important to sort of assess the disease activity based on the activity scores. The PI needs to ensure and review the pre-screening and screening checklist to confirm the eligibility. If you are not able to do that, make sure that you delegate a GI provider to confirm this eligibility and verify this afterwards, because again, there are some extra steps involved in getting the study up and running, and the intervention started with that 2-week baseline visit where the patients are not going to be starting the intervention diet and will be basically on their regular diet while tracking their symptoms to make sure that they are not making changes before that active intervention starts. Next slide, please. Along with ensuring eligibility and recruitment, it is also important that we continue to keep an eye on the progress and keeping an eye on the timeline. If we need to adjust the timeline, the processes, we need to make sure that we are keeping our research coordinators engaged, so that if we need to modify it, they are up to speed on that. And again, communicating with the central research team if significant modifications are being thought about would be really important, so that we can share some of those learnings across the sites. It is also important that we as site PIs monitor the recruitment to ensure that potentially eligible patients are being approached in a way that is consistent with the site-specific processes. Sometimes we have found out that that if the sites are not conceptualizing the processes of approach and identification, they may miss out some eligible patients and will not be able to be prepared not only for identification, but for even those patients who are identified, approaching them and discussing the nitty-gritty of the protocol down the line. Next slide.
So this is me, Shahzad. I'm going to take over from here. It's Heather. So I think we spent a bulk of the time really talking about, your role as champion in study advertising and helping your colleagues identify patients and helping make patients aware so that we create a pull when people are self-identifying, and then the important role that you have in identifying patients and kind of moving them through the process to the point where they get to the baseline visit. And not saying that it's smooth sailing from here for you, but we've done training yesterday with the dietitians and tomorrow with the CRCs, and they'll really be managing the nuts and bolts of patients progressing through the study timeline. So at a high level today, Lisa and I will go over some of what your role here is, which is in general just to make sure that your team is doing what's necessary to move people through the process. But a lot of the nitty-gritty will happen by the dietitian and the CRC, which we will cover in their training. So again, as Shahzad and Jen both mentioned, that baseline enrollment visit is where everything kicks off. It's where patients are going to be consented, their app's going to be downloaded and configured, they're going to get their diet education, and they're going to start that baseline baseline data collection where they stay on their new diet, their original diet. Sorry, I was up all night on call, sorry. They'll stay on their original diet for 2 weeks, and then they'll start the trial 2 weeks after that. So next slide. So for you guys at that baseline enrollment visit, the key is really around eligibility verification. So signing off that patients are eligible before they're enrolled in the study, either if you're the provider or whether you identify a designee who can understand those enrollment criteria and look at them and sign off, and then you can just verify after. You want to make sure that we, if we're having contact with patients in advance, that we can make it easy to make sure that all those things that need to be in place to verify eligibility are actually going to be present at that enrollment visit, that we can confirm that they had their standard visit 2 weeks before, that they have their PUCAI or their SPCDAI, and they have mild to moderate disease, that they've had lab work within the last 8 weeks that meets your study-specific criteria for being elevated, and that we can get a baseline vitamin D level included in their lab work as standard of care for starting a diet intervention. So again, this is kind of your standard procedures, but making sure that these things are happening in a sequence that will enable the patient to be enrolled at this baseline enrollment visit. Next slide. We have a current version of the protocols, version 4.1. There'll be one new amendment going in soon with some final things. So key to review those inclusion and exclusion criteria before we get started. This is an example of a checklist that we'll have for your CRCs to allow them to pre-screen some of those static criteria that aren't going to change from visit to visit to see if someone's eligible. And then also at the baseline visit, verify with screening criteria that people have met the actual eligibility criteria. So the key for you guys is to look at the final protocol version, make yourselves aware of the current inclusion exclusion criteria, raise any questions or concerns that you have so that you can feel confident verifying a patient is eligible for the study prior to their enrollment. Next slide. Next slide. Go ahead. Keep going. The second touch point for the study, again, these are going to be heavily managed by the CRC and the dietitian. So after their baseline visit, they're going to be on their regular diet for 2 weeks, and then the app will tell them to go ahead and start their N of 1 trial. 2 weeks after starting their first diet, they're going to come back to clinic to see typically the dietitian, to at least see the dietitian. Based on your own study clinic workflow, you may need to tweak that to look a little bit different, but they're going to want to see the dietitian to make sure everything's going okay with the diet, to make sure they haven't lost too much weight, and to troubleshoot and provide support for them as they go on and make this lifestyle change. So that's going to happen 2 weeks after they start each diet for the first time. So that's diet A and diet B. Next slide. So your role in that, again, this is going to be very much managed by the dietitian and the CRC, but the dietitian is going to be meeting with the patient and talking to them about how things are going, how their symptoms are doing. They're going to be looking at the data that the participant has been entering over that first 2 weeks of being on the new diet and asking the patient how they're doing. So if the dietitian's raising concerns about significant symptoms or things are changing, then you're going to want to step in and review that with the dietitian and the primary GI provider to make sure that the patient is safe and tolerating things okay. If the dietitian raises any concerns about how the patient is handling the diet with respect to nutritional adequacy, he or she may raise those to you as well as the primary GI provider. So it's important to have a plan in place to deal with those. In addition, if the dietitian notices any worsening symptoms or new symptoms or significant weight loss that would qualify as an adverse event, they're going to raise that to your attention to work with the CRC to document that as a potential adverse event. As we've discussed in the past, weight loss can be a challenge for patients in the first couple of weeks of starting the SCD. Typically, they're going to lose less than 5%, but if they're losing anywhere between 5 and 7%, we're going to want to make sure that those patients are followed closely to ensure that their weight loss stabilizes and they don't get into a risk of severe malnutrition with significant weight loss. So for you to make sure you coordinate with their provider to make sure that they're being followed closely if they have weight loss. And then a study criteria for automatic withdrawal is severe weight loss of greater than 7.5%. So you're going to want to be aware of that and document that if it's happening. Next slide. Lisa, I think this one's you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So really quickly, I want to go through just a few more slides here because I know we're coming up on the top of the hour. So Heather just talked about the dietitian follow-ups. And so the next study touch point is going to be the 8-week in-clinic follow-up visit. And this is the touch point that happens 8 weeks after they've started their first diet, SCD or MSCD. And it is a standard of care clinic visit. Next slide. So here's the role of the site PI in this visit. At this visit, it will really primarily be the site PI who is having contact with the patient. So it's to be aware that a patient in the PRODUCE study is being seen for the standard of care visit to ensure that the anthropometric assessment is completed. And if any adverse events are noted due to weight loss, that the appropriate adverse events and SAEs and CRFs are completed, to ensure the clinical evaluation is completed, and to evaluate diet side effects and complete any relevant CRFs, to evaluate that nutritional adequacy, including vitamin D status, has been looked at, and to evaluate continued understanding of the diet, and to ensure that any needed future standard of care visits are scheduled. So all of those things are what needs to happen as part of the just patient standard of care visit with their primary clinician, and as part of the PRODUCE protocol. Next slide. Okay. So in addition to the next study touch point or additional study touch points that we'll have, we've just gone over the in-person touch points that patients have. And that follow-up, in-clinic follow-up visit with the patient standard of care visit with the patient's GI doc is really only scheduled after the first 8 weeks on the diet. And that's really considered standard of care for patients who have transitioned to a new diet. We do not have those scheduled throughout the remainder of the study. The patient's remaining standard of care visits would be at the discretion and as appropriate based on your clinic and the patient's needs until the end of the study, which is results review. So there are also some telephone touch points with the dietitians that happen at the midpoint of each of the diet periods, and there are 4 of them. So 4 to 5 weeks into each diet period, the dietitian talks to the participant on the phone, and we'll have a diet diary. We'll have a diet diary nutritional analysis associated with that, and we'll provide further education. Next slide. So the role of the site PI is related to the dietitian phone follow-ups is really to make sure that those are happening, to make sure that the dietitian and the CRFC are identifying approaches to reach families and to schedule those phone calls, and that appropriate plans of actions are put in place if there's any changes or concerning symptoms that the dietitian identifies relative to the participant data, which she will be able to see all of the data the patient is putting in as it will be recorded on the Eureka mobile and digital platform. And also to follow up with participants and complete any appropriate adverse event forms in the REDCap database as needed if the participant is reporting new or worsened symptoms to the dietitian and has weight loss of greater than 5%. So that's a really important piece that we need to follow associated with the study and respond to and react to. Next slide. Okay. So I know we've kind of covered those last contacts or touch points that we'll have with participants somewhat quickly. We're going over them in detail with the dietitians and with the CRCs, as Heather said. The final point, touch point, and the for the study for patients in the study is the results review, which happens at about approximately 34 weeks. So patients come back to clinic and they will meet with their primary GI clinician who's been supporting them throughout the study to review the results of their individual N of 1 trials. Next slide. And it's really the site PI's responsibility for teaching the GI providers about N-of-1 results so that the provider is able to review with the participant. And we will have a future training as we get farther into this study that will be dedicated specifically to what are the N-of-1 results that patients receive back and how, what do they mean and how to go through them with people. Next slide. Okay. One of the key things that, at Site PI we've gone through it, there's a lot of stages and a lot of different touch points and steps in this study. The Site PI is really responsible for reviewing and reporting any protocol deviations that might be associated with timing of study visits, and working with the CRC and making sure that that information is communicated back to us at the coordinating center. So, really understanding the study timeline and making sure that the coordinator is implementing that, and if there's deviations to report and to let us know is really critical throughout this study. Next slide. The other important piece is the Site PI's role in participant monitoring, and again, making sure that the Site PI is aware of what is the experience of the patients who are in the study, what is happening, with their symptoms, and making sure that the data is being reviewed at a regular frequency, and responded to if patients are having symptoms or weight loss, and also then in making sure that everything is getting reported and evaluated as to whether it's an adverse event or a serious adverse event and responded to appropriately. I think we're right at the top of the hour here. Team, do you want to keep going? We have a couple more slides here. Team, do you want to keep going?
Yeah, let's keep going, Lisa, because we had it timed pretty well, and then just with the tech issues, we're a little bit behind and the delayed start. So maybe let's just try and. So
hopefully we can take this about 5 more minutes if people are able to stay just really quickly. So other things that the Site PI is really responsible for monitoring and participants is ensuring that the site coordinating center, that we're aware of people who have poor tracker completion rates. Again, on the Eureka platform, your CRC will be able to tell if people are completing that data. They will be asked to complete data on a daily basis, and the importance of that is if they don't complete the data, they're not going to get good answers back for themselves. And so they're putting a lot of time and effort into the diet, so we really need them to be answering the symptom trackers on a daily basis, which will be very quick for them. So letting us know and working with the CRC to problem solve around participants who are not able to at least have a 50% completion rate, providing any encouragement to participants and helping them with any questions that are needed for support at the encounters, and then ensuring that the primary GI provider is also encouraging participants to continue in with the different lifestyle changes that are associated with the study and then identifying any support needs. Next slide. Okay, in terms of adverse event reporting, the PI, this is really important, the PI should solicit information on any changes in patient status from the patient's primary GI and dietitian after scheduled or unscheduled contacts. If symptoms are worsening based on data tracked in the Eureka app or based on reports from the patient encounters, the PI should discuss with the primary GI provider, and a plan should be made to contact the patient and assess for treatment needs and the ability to continue in the study. Complete an adverse event form in REDCap database for any new or worsening symptoms. Really, really important. Next slide. The following are expected adverse events: mild to moderate increase in abdominal pain, diarrhea, gas, bloating within the first month or so of starting the new diet. A weight loss greater than 5% but less than 7.5%, again in the first few weeks of starting this new diet, is an expected adverse event. Worsening of IBD due to failure of the diet to improve disease. So this could be new onset or worsened bloody stools, diarrhea, abdominal pains, fistula, abscess, or bowel obstruction. and then hospitalization or surgery due to failure of the diet to improve the disease. Any adverse events that are unexpected but determined to be related to the intervention will be reported to the IRB at the time of continuing review. So even expected adverse events we need you to fill out the red cap information on, and then the appropriate ones will be reported to IRB. Next slide. Okay, and this is just an example of what the adverse event reporting form CRF will look like. Next slide. Okay. Serious adverse events are those that are fatal, life-threatening, require a prolonged hospital stay, result in persistent or significant disability or incapacity, congenital anomaly or birth defect or an important medical event, and related to study participation, unexpected, serious or involved risks to subjects or others, and are not deemed to be a consequence of the patient's underlying disease. They must be reported to the IRB. We have to fill out the serious adverse event CRF. We have to notify the coordinating center via email. Other information in narrative form may be required within very short time period to help in understanding the event. And SAEs will always be reported to the IRB as defined in Cincinnati's policies. Next slide. And then the site PI is responsible for confirming any decision to drop a participant from the study. The following are reasons for participant withdrawal: tracker non-response in the baseline period. So if parents are tracking less than 50% in those first baseline couple weeks, they will be dropped from the study because it doesn't bode well or indicate that they'll be able to maintain throughout the study. Failure to return a stool specimen, this is critical and really a gatekeeper to staying in the study and moving on through the diet intervention. Symptom worsening leading to the diet being stopped, medication changed, or surgical intervention. Participants becoming pregnant during the study, participants losing greater than 7.5% weight loss, participant is unable or willing to continue the diet or data collection. And the PI should discuss all withdrawals with the site coordinating center. Next slide. And the final thing is, it's really important for the site PI to be knowledgeable about the specific carbohydrate diet and the modifications to make it the MSCD diet. And so there are lots and lots of resources on the NIMBLE website and the produce section of the NIMBLE website, which is where we're housing all the study materials and study information and information about what the diet is and how to follow it. So please review all produce materials that are available to participants. And also, you should have received an email yesterday. We condensed the dietitian training on what the nuts and bolts of the SCD diet into a shortened, about 20-minute version. Sent out a link to that yesterday, and we strongly suggest that everyone review that, all the site PIs, so that you have a good understanding of what the SCD diet involves for the participants. Next slide. I think we're at the end here. Okay. All right. So that is the last bit of information we presented. I know that we just really put through a lot of information and a lot of details at you. All of this will be documented in the study operating procedure manuals that you will receive and the CRCs and dietitians will receive. But I'm just going to stop right here and just see if anyone has any, who's still on the call, has any questions or would like further information on anything. I know it may take some time to just kind of sort through and sift through all of this before questions come up. Michelle, you can let us know if there's any questions.
I don't see any hands. If anyone has a question and you want to put your hand up, I could unmute you. I do not see anything in the chat box either. We didn't have any questions throughout the presentation. So if anybody wants to chat anything in now or raise your hand, I'm happy to unmute you. Okay. I do not.
And we will send out the slides too, so that as you stop and digest and start to reflect more on the materials as we're really starting to gear up for activation, I'm sure questions will come up or you'll have thoughts. And so please just reach out. In addition, as we're going to talk about with the CRCs tomorrow, the next steps are to really think about how this is going to be implemented at your at your center, particularly as it relates to the swim lanes and how you're going to identify patients and then move them through the process of the timing for their standard medical visits and then for their enrollment visits. And so sitting with your team and thinking about that and thinking about how that's going to operate at your site, I'm sure will generate some questions. So please reach out, and then we'll have one-on-one calls with your sites as well before you're up and ready to enroll. So plenty of opportunities to raise comments, questions, raise comments, ask questions, that kind of thing.
Okay, and Dr. Boyle, you should be unmuted if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, my two questions. First one is for the first 8-week visit. I'm understanding that we have a 1-week window, plus minus 1 week for the first visit after they start their first phase of the diet. Is that right?
I think so. You're right.
Okay.
Are you asking, sorry, for the dietitian visit or for the standard of care visit?
For the of care visit, once they start the diet, that once they get placed on the first arm of the diet, then there's a standard of care visit at 8 weeks. So
Right.
I was just making that we have a 1 week window plus minus 1 week for the standard of care visit.
I'm double checking. I'm pulling it up right now, but there is a window for sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think it is 1 week, but I'll verify while you're on the phone right now.
The second question I had was, you were thinking that if the patient is unable to submit the stool, then that's elimination criteria. What if a patient is sick, say they get C. diff or they have intercurrent illness, the calprotectin will not be reliable. So in those cases, should we continue them with the current arm of the diet till they recover and then do the stool study? What do we do in those patients?
It's a very good question, and I don't think so that we have sort of envisioned that potential we haven't had a lot of discussion around that aspect of possibility happening. So I think we can bring that back to our research team and see. It would make a lot of sense to delay obtaining that fecal cal in that situation because it's going to be altered by the intercurrent illness.
Mm-hmm.
The question would come up: how long do you delay it? And I don't think so that we have a good understanding of whether 1 week, 2 weeks, or 3 weeks is good enough in that setting or not.
Okay.
And I did just look it up, and it's 8 weeks plus or minus 2 weeks, actually.
2 weeks. That's awesome.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's because some of our patients come from far. Sometimes they have issues. So 2 weeks is really good. Thank you.
Yep.
And I would encourage everybody to brainstorm about these kind of situations. Your questions actually have helped us refine the protocol and make it more practical at certain levels as well, while keeping the research fidelity and diligence in place. So your question, Alka, about the C. diff is relevant, and I think we need to put our brains around that possibility from how to sort of manage that. I would also encourage people to get in touch with the central research team if these kind of scenarios are happening, so that we can actually have a good collective discussion about it.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I don't see any other questions anywhere at this time.
Let's start thinking about how this recruitment would look like at your site, because I think there are lots of learnings that can happen from thinking about this.
Yeah, so please reach out to us, because that was an issue that we had, and all these scenarios help us think through how would you do something in this case, so we can make sure that we address that so that we're consistent across centers. So if you come up with well, this hypothetical case or that hypothetical case, it really helps if you just shoot us an email so that we can figure out if we're adequately addressing that in the protocol, because that was one maybe that we didn't think through. So please, as you sit and process the information, reach out if you have comments, questions, thoughts, that will just make the study better. We have some time, maybe, you know, not too much time. We don't want to be making a ton of protocol changes, but we want to get it good to go. So we have a small window now to be able to make a change if we need to. And thanks everyone for your time, and apologies for the technical glitches that put us a little bit behind.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks.
Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.